Dear students, welcome to EPG Pathshala. Today in this module we are going to talk about urban ecology. This is the second module, second part of the modules on urban ecology. Here we will talk about commons and communities. This module looks at the concept of urban commons and talks about why the issue has acquired critical importance within the sphere of urban ecology. This module will introduce students to Henri Lefebvre's concept of right to the city, which he elaborated in his book in 1968, and the practices of commoning and the research on the state of commons in Indian cities that are influenced by critical urban studies scholar and Marxist scholars such as David Harvey. We start this module with a question for those of you who live in the metropolis or state capitals. Have you ever wondered why do you find it so hard to walk on the footpath? Have you ever wondered why on some stretch of the road there are no footpaths at all? Not just pedestrians, even cycling enthusiasts as well as cycle rickshaw pullers find it hard to figure out their share on the common resources called roads, which are filled with motorized emission guzzling vehicles. In this module, we are going to continue our explorations into urban ecology by paying close attention to urban commons and responses from the communities to urban commons. A wide spectrum of theoretical reflections offer myriad ways to define the concept of urban commons, and most of these consist three constitutive elements. The first is common resources, the second is institutions or commoning practices, and third is the communities or the community of commoners who are involved in productions and reproductions of commons. As various authors ranging from Henri Lefebvre's Right to the City to David Harvey, The Rebel Cities, have suggested through their work, the urban commons also entails inspirations for the building of resistance to the encroaching forces of state and capital that repeatedly tried to expropriate and overtake commons in order to serve vested interests. More than 100 years ago, in 1910, Jane Addams was a committed thinker to creating a living democracy in the teeming cities of the industrial America, and she published a book titled 20 Years at Hull House that has been celebrated as a pioneering work in the task of commoning. At the heart of her vision were the principles such as participation, reciprocity, and the democratic cooperation. Lefebvre's idea of the right to the city draws from the imagination of urban habitat as an oeuvre, as an ongoing work of art, whose creation, use, and reshaping is constantly being practiced by inhabitants. Writing at a time of great upheaval in Europe, Lefebvre had imagined the right to the city concept to not merely a reform proposal, but as a cry and demand, the right to occupy and protest, and a working slogan and an ideal. For Lefebvre, the city stood as a metaphor for the entire city, and so in that 1968 book, he expounded the right to participation in urban life and extended the same to the marginalized groups also. David Harvey calls the city, and I quote, that site where people of all sorts and classes mingle, however reluctantly and agonistically, to produce a common, if perpetually changing and transitory life. However, what could have appeared to Ambedkar at several decades ago as a habitat that offered promise to Dalits for an escape from the exploitation and servitude of an Indian feudal tradition-bound village, in last few decades have increasingly become a space that not just allows anonymity and the springboard on the path of struggle to success, but a habitat that is under the constant threats of exclusions and evictions. Making an intervention in the epistemologies and methodologies of urban studies, Ananya Roy's article, Slumdog Cities, Rethinking Subaltern Urbanism, seeks to understand and transform the ways in which cities of the global south are studied and represented in urban research and to some extent in the popular discourses. In doing so, the article's primary concern is formation of ideas, subaltern urbanism, which undertakes the theorization of the megacities and its subaltern spaces and subaltern class, of which the narratives of the slum, of which the ubiquitous slum is the most prominent. Roy outlines how writing against apocalyptic and dystopian narratives of the slum Subaltern urbanism provides accounts of the slum and slum dwellers as a terrain of habitation, livelihoods, and politics. Roy's article specifically engages with four categories, namely peripheries, urban informality, zones of exceptions, and grey spaces. Anant Maringanti, in an article titled No Estoppel, claiming right to the city via commons, highlights how in Indian cities unprecedented and unregulated growth, incremental land use changes, privatization and chaotic civic infrastructure provisioning are fracturing resources created over centuries and reducing the right to the city to mere right to housing and property, thus shortchanging the concept's transformative potential. Unquote. Drawing on the experience of activism around protecting water bodies in Hyderabad to build an expanded conception of urban commons, Maringanti argues that, and I quote, urban actors need to draw inspirations from the way social movements world over, including India, have deployed the notion of the commons as a defense against corporate exploitation of biodiversity. Unquote. Maringanti reminds us that in order to grasp the import of the concept right to the city, we need to consider the 1985 ruling of Supreme Court in Olga Tellis and others versus Bombay Municipal Council case. Maringanti proposes that in cities like those of India, an engagement between the right to the city and the right to the commons, that is the right to oppose enclosures of shared resources in cities, can open up several new possibilities for creating better cities. For realization of such a proposal, Maringanti asks us to consider asking two questions, and I quote, what is the just and efficacious political praxis that produces commons in defense against unethical and exclusionary exploitation that facilitates the unjust order of accumulation and social oppression? What kind of praxis can facilitate appropriation that is sensitive to a new ethic of the commons and fosters the right to the city with an Indian sensibility? Unquote. Talking about urban commons, Gidwani and Bhaviskar states that urban commons include so-called public goods, the air we breathe, public parks and spaces, public transportation, public sanitation systems, public schools, public waterways, and so forth. They quickly add that urban commons can also include the less obvious municipal garbage that provides livelihood to waste speakers, wetlands, water bodies, and riverbeds that sustain fishing communities, streets as arteries of movements, but also as places where people work, live, love, dream, and voice dissent, and local bazaars that are sites of commons and cultural invention. They raise the concern over the ongoing diminution of urban commons that are critical to economic production in cities, to the cultural vibrancy and the cement of community, to learning how to do democracy through practices of creating, governing, and defending collective resources, to regenerating the sense of place that forms communities, and ultimately to the reproduction of urban populations and ecosystems. In a conversation with Rohan D'Souza, Dr. Bhuvneshwari Raman, who has studied local markets in Bengaluru and wrote her doctoral dissertation on this theme at London School of Economics, says that, I quote, it is difficult to formulate a generic definition of commons and communities because the shared interests and values that underpin the production of commons themselves are in a flux, often generating fluid and flexible groupings of the people and different interpretations of histories and therefore claims. Unquote. She adds that this difficulty brings up questions like on whose behalf commons are mobilized and by whom. She views the commons as a contested space of a field where local populations compete among themselves and with actors outside their territorial boundary over the use, control and protection of valuable resources such as land, water and other types of resources. According to Raman, there are two problems with the dominant conception of the commons. The first one gets represented in the tendency to romanticize the commons, particularly among civil society actors. Raman states that, I quote, at one end of the spectrum is the tendency to museumize the commons, viewing them as pristine terrains with efforts to conserve them, while at the other end of the spectrum is the belief that enshrining particular groups' rights to the commons in law will automatically strengthen their claims, often drawing on history and culture. Unquote. She adds that the problem arises when a realization dawns upon us that there is no single history. Rather, there are many histories, and the law is a social construct, and its violence is reflected, in the words of Nicholas Blomley, the professor of geography at Simon Fraser University, through limited processes and mechanisms such as the survey, greed, and plan, ultimately creating situations where these attempts may prove counterproductive. Writing about the contradictory situations of ever expanding urban sprawl, a noted researcher on urban commons, Harini Nagendra, states, and I quote, "From my office on the ninth floor of a tall building in an academic campus in Bangalore, I have a bird's eye view of the city's peri-urban surroundings. To the west, I can see a 6-lane high-speed highway choked by traffic, full of people frantically commuting from their homes in the city to their jobs in the globally famous information technology campuses located just outside. To the east, I am fortunate to witness a completely different picture. A tranquil, marshy wetland and freshwater lake with dozens of cows grazing and cooling down in the water while the midday sun blazes overhead, accompanied as companions by hundreds of cattle, egrets feeding on the insects that annoy the cattle. This idyllic picture of cooperation, mutualism, and rural bliss has evolved and been sustained over centuries in Bangalore. Bangalore's lakes are not natural but were created and maintained by local communities with a history that can be traced as far back as 450 AD. Yet even this picture is marred by the construction and dumping of large mounds of debris into the wetland at one side of the lake." Unquote. 12 years before Harini Nagendra penned these thoughts, in the year 2002, city authorities in Bangalore had taken a decision to lease out in a public-private partnership 60 of its tanks. This would have meant that the spaces and resources which had undergone a change from being part of 6 streams of irrigation tanks to lakes would undergo yet another transformation into places for recreation and amusement and commercial spaces with closed access. Citizens came together to organize a resistance movement that culminated into a 2008 High Court order and managed to prevent the enclosures of the commons. Simultaneously, urban communities organized themselves to revive wetland and created an example of how, through collective actions, citizens can create urban commons, as the form of Kaikondhanhalli Lake Initiative has shown us. On 29th June 2015, a CAG audit report on the performance of Lake Development Authority in Karnataka was tabled in the State Assembly. This performance review outlines the ecological health of lakes as well as issues on the institutions of governance and management of lakes. Raman claims that competing groups mobilize different institutions and conventions to establish their control over resources. She states that in contemporary times, one of the ways in which the competition plays out is in terms of restricting power relations by enacting changes in laws, institutional structures, that is, states and its agencies, and the role of agents inside and outside the state domain. In short, she deciphers the crisis as shrinking of the political space to maneuver claims and urges that rather than assuming bureaucratic politics and civil society as above that of the electoral local politics, those who are concerned about urban commons should spend energies to realign the levers of political realm and strengthen local governance institutions. The slums that emerge when migrant families come together and occupy public spaces create its peculiar culture of shared space in many urban locations in India, where the governments have failed to ensure right to housing. Mumbai saw the largest conglomeration of such slums in Dharavi, where what used to be mangrove swamp inhabited by Koli fisherfolk gradually moved in by making room for Kumbhas from Gujarat to create potters' colonies, and Tamils who came and opened tanneries, and migrant workers from Uttar Pradesh who came to work in the booming textile industries. Closely linked to the issues of housing is how the public spaces come to be used by tenacious migrant entrepreneurs to earn livelihood by operating in informal economy. The millions of hawkers and street vendors do have a very intimate interdependence with the streets of urban locations that they trade from. Anjaria talks about the essential presence of hawkers in Mumbai city, which requires a critical understanding of the functioning of public space. Anjaria proposes that despite a long historical presence in Mumbai, street hawking today is viewed with a deep resentment by elite NGOs and residents' associations and hawkers as a menace who inappropriately use streets and footpaths, block traffic, depress real estate values, etc. To such an elite imagination of affluent citizens of Mumbai, hawkers appear as an eyesore that prevents the financial capital of India to stand in the league of world-class cities. By narrating the experience of hawkers in Mumbai and elsewhere in India, Anjaria states that they do not fear a regulatory state, but a predatory state. A state that constantly demands bribes and threatens with demolitions, against which a license provides security. Unquote. Towards the end of the article, Anjaria draws attention to Mike Davis writing about North American cities and arguing how the immigrants from the South and Central America, because of their vigorous and multifarious use of public space for commerce and sociality, form one of the most important constituencies for the preservation of urban commons, to suggest why not take heed from studies such as Davis as well. Elaborating on the theme of creation of urban commons, Marxist thinker David Harvey argues that while the public spaces and public goods contribute mightily to the qualities of the commons, it takes political action on the part of citizens and the people to appropriate them or to make them so. Syntagma Square in Athens, Tahrir Square in Cairo, and the Plaza de Catalunya in Barcelona were public spaces that became commons as people assembled there to express their political views and make demands. Harvey adds that the common is not therefore something that existed once upon a time, that has since been lost, but something that is, like the urban commons, continuously being produced. However, as Harvey points out, the problem is that it is just as continuously being enclosed and appropriated by capital in its commodified and monetized form, even as it is being continuously produced by collective labor. So, as argued by Harvey, the distinction between urban public goods and urban commons is both fluid and dangerously porous. And it is very important to reflect on the social practice of commoning or communing. Harvey calls our attention to these practices that produce or establish social relations with a common whose and uses are either exclusive to a social group or partially or fully open to all and sundry. So Harvey views urbanization as the perpetual production of an urban commons or its shadow form of public places and public goods, and its perpetual appropriation and destruction by private interests. Unquote. For example, the roads in cities are being re-envisioned with the wealthy few pressing for more flyovers, pressing for more elevated highways and expressways, even as the urban authorities neglect underpasses and skywalks for pedestrians. In New Delhi, the bus rapid transit system corridor have proved out to be a catalyst for debate on how much of a road space shall be prioritized for public transport, just like the older debate of cycle rickshaw pullers staking claims on the roads and streets of Old Delhi. In 2011, when lobby groups got the government to launch the costly 200 crore most expensive tender shore roads in Bengaluru, citizens put up resistance under the banner of Forum for Urban Commons and Governance. Talking about the research studies on urban commons in India, Parthasarathy states that research on urban commons in India is scarce, though there are signs of increasing interest. Parthasarathy claims that the focus is on issues that reflect core concerns of urban sociology and critical urban studies, such as streets, maidans, lakes, parks, garbage disposal sites, etc. He claims that the identification of commons by researchers does recognize issues of class, gender, inequality, and the concerns of urban poor, but on the whole seems to be more of a reaction to exclusionary tendencies and the takeover of common facilities and sites by the middle classes and elite. He also argues that while destruction of commons or diminishing of commons is a recurrent theme in the literature on urban commons, the continued use, preservation, maintenance, and regeneration of natural resources and natural resource enclaves in the city is linked to an Indian bourgeois logic whose significance is not adequately grasped and cannot be explained purely in terms of short-term capital accumulation and class struggle. Outlining a series of questions that needs to be posed, Parthasarathy shows that in existing research literature on urban commons, questions are rarely raised beyond the routine ones of struggles over access and exclusion with reference to common civic natural resources such as lakes and parks, common facilities, that is playgrounds, or the use of streets and footpaths for vending, hawking, housing, and so on. According to him, the research on urban commons need to urgently address the following questions, and I quote, how and from where do the urban poor meet their fuelwood needs? What are the sources of food and fodder for urban livestock holders? How do the urban poor and lower middle class meet their food requirement? What kind of resources and resource dependencies are exhibited in the livelihood strategies of the street vendors and hawkers and of sundry artisanal groups working in the city? Are urban and peri-urban natural resource pools and commons, for instance, fish from lakes, rivulets, creeks, ponds, and other water bodies, integrated into the supply chains of small retailers, wholesalers, and supermarkets, as well as of eateries and restaurants? Parthasarathy claims that it is this kind of commons, that is ecological commons, used for livelihood dependencies, but also feeding into domestic and transnational commodity chains that are of interest for his article Hunters, Gatherers and Foragers in a Metropolis, commonizing the private and the public in Mumbai. Amita Bhaviskar, in her essay, What the Eye Does Not See, the Yamuna in the Imagination of Delhi, traces the shifting visibility of the river Yamuna in the social and ecological imaginations of Delhi, and argues that the riverbed has changed from being a neglected non-place to prized real estate for private and public corporations. In recent times, Delhi has witnessed encroachments of floodplains of the river, not by poor squatters only, as it has often been assumed, but also by a grandiose temple, by the public sector undertaking that manages transportation and several such interests. Side by side, there have been mobilizations of citizens across Yamuna River under the banner of Yamuna Ji Abhiyan and environmental litigations that contested such takeovers of the floodplains.